unanimity on a particular issue, but in other areas you may have great fragmentation. But what the group does do is it sort of discreetly codifies the legitimate. So within these elite circles over a period of time, newcomers and even existing people within the group will learn to acknowledge what they consider to be legitimate responses. And that's an extremely important thing, because learning what constitutes legitimate is essential from an individual perspective to being accepted and maintained within these groups. But also, of course, as I said at the outset, controlling our sense of the legitimate is critical in international relations, because it acts as it creates the capacity for action. So yes, the contribution is much more idiosyncratic, much softer. It's impossible to say with any degree of certainty just how much of an influence Bilderberg or the World Economic Forum or a Trilateral Commission, individually how much impact that they've had. Who knows? And we will probably never know the answer to that question. What we do know is that those in elite circles are sufficiently persuaded of the significance and influence of these organizations that they A, want to be members of them, and B, whether they know it or not, are influenced by them. And I can state that with a good degree of confidence, because practically all of the people that we spoke to denied that there was any effect of the interactions and the conference itself, that they walked away and they would never be the sorts of people that were influenced by any attempt to manipulate them or to challenge the way that they felt. However, they were in the very same breath more than happy to acknowledge and accept that they had had their views improved, modified by greater information access, by the fact that they'd heard experts talking about subjects, and so they saw this as an extremely logical, rational process, that in fact we all have the capacity to improve our views, but fundamentally I'm not having my opinion shaped. Well, clearly those two things are incompatible. Now, what follows from that is a discussion, of course, about whether or not the group is attempting to shape opinions. And that's a very, very difficult question to answer. We conclude that it does shape opinions, but for the most part unconsciously. So the biases that exist within Bilderberg and other networks of its kind are historical, social, structural. They exist. They're systemic almost. They're perpetuated by things like the selection procedures and so forth. People coming into the group, learning who's influential, not influential, and trying to respond to that. This perpetuates a bias within the system. Now, whether that's purposeful or not, we can't say with any degree of certainty. Our view, based upon the interviews we had, both with peripheral members and members of the steering committee, is that this is a largely unconscious outcome. But we can't, you can't exclude the possibility that, of course, there is an inner quorum of the group, and we know there is an inner group, if you like, that has a particular agenda. But I would suggest that if they do have one, again, it's largely unconscious, in the sense of them not recognizing that when they put something on the agenda, it's inherently biased. They do generally think that they're non-partisan. And that clearly is not the case. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to look at the attendance list of this organization to recognize that this is not a diverse spectrum of societal interest. At the same time, if you ask these people, they will tell you it's incredibly diverse. And they believe that because they discuss diverse opinion. But when you ask them what they felt about trade unionists, for instance, or whatever it may be, but trade unionists is a popular subject with Bilderberg, it's quite clear that trade unionists are, they just don't fit very well. And, the Bilderbergers will say, well, they just weren't very, intelligent, or we didn't feel that they did this or that. But the bottom line is they just don't fit philosophically or personally with the broader requirements of the group. Which incidentally, I should just point out, if you're going to if you're going to move into this type of elite circle, one absolute prerequisite is that you must have the capacity to transcend your constituents' position. So part of the idea here is it's rather like trying to create new paths, trying to create new consensuses and so forth, requires that a trade unionist disengage themselves from their immediate constituent demands. So in other words, let's just park your constituents for a moment and try and discuss as human beings, people, what's required. If you can't do that, then you're considered to be somehow rather two-dimensional and immature. So within these types of elite settings, these sort of rather wise old boys, if you like, if you're not capable of showing your maturity by rising above the demands of your political or business domains, then you're not there yet, you know. And I think that's again an important personal aspect to this.
Okay, just to unpack some of the points that you made, it was actually very interesting. So from what I gathered and what point I would make here is that I personally don't believe that the Bilderberg group sits down and has an agenda that they're going to do X, Y, and Z this year, and the result is going to be Z, and they're basically going to control the world. That is not really how any kind of political negotiations, regardless of the framework, because national politics is too complicated and complex, let alone international politics intertwined with economics. So, for example, if you were going to take an issue that's quite salient at the moment, whether or not it's been discussed at the Bilderberg Group previously or anywhere else in an elite network this year, is just using the example of Iran. Now, that may come up in an elite network somewhere, and then somewhere down the line, a decision will come to the fore about what to do with Iran. But then, in terms of the causal chain, you can't pinpoint where the idea A arose and B where, as you're rightly stating, the consensus grew. So would it be a think tank in this country? Would it be a conversation between certain governmental officials? Would it be a cabinet discussion? Would it be something in an elite group? In that respect, it's too complex to pin down who's responsible, if at all, and it is more likely a social psychological subconscious issue where it is kind of everyone kind of wants to fit the mold, even though ironically they're saying they're not fitting the mold. But this is how consensus works in every day, and the political world is no different. So that point is a very salient, and I agree with that. Just in terms of the Bilderberg group, because you've alluded to it a few times, is the steering committee. Now, first of all, if you just from your research expand on that and who briefly makes it up, and if you're in your research with the people you spoke about, is there an idea of who sets the agenda for the 3 days, as in what's going to be discussed? Do you know that, or is that something the steering committee does? What is their role? Because obviously we've got fringe people that come and go year on year, and if obviously for whatever reason you're not invited back the next year, but you've got this core steering committee. So could you just expand on who makes that up and what kind of powers they have in terms of framing the issues and debates that people will talk over for 3 days?
Yeah, well, the peripheral thing, just touch on that briefly once more. As I said, over 50% of people are not invited back. And you got to understand that from a personal perspective, that's quite a heavy slight. Because one thing that people underestimate is just how much many people at the periphery of this type of network want to be in it. So, you know, to get in it and yet not to be invited back is a reflection of many things. But it's curious because people at the center of the network, certainly in the steering committee, use one word time and time again to describe people who really aren't the right sort of people. And that word is dull. It was rather dull. And it's quite an old establishment English word, but I've heard people other than the English saying it. And I find that quite interesting because it's quite a damning slight to be described as dull. But you can imagine just what that might mean, to be rejected in that way, and it actually brings about all sorts of defensive